Welcome to Israel Now News. I'm Rebecca Roberts.
And I'm Yochanan El-Rom.
In our top story, the radical Islamist world is in mourning after Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi died in a helicopter crash last week. The country's foreign minister and 7 other top dignitaries also perished in the crash in the mountains of northwestern Iran. Known as the Butcher of Tehran, Raisi was responsible for the mass executions of thousands of Iranian dissidents. He was a close advisor to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and was one of the leading candidates to succeed the 85-year-old dictator. Raisi was a hardline Islamist who directed and funded dozens of terrorist attacks, including the massacre of 1,200 people in Israel on October 7th. Hamas leaders sent their deepest condolences and praised the terror leader Raisi for his support of the Palestinian cause and his resistance against Israel.
The administration of U.S. President Joe Biden continues to hold talks with Saudi leaders to advance a security deal that would see the Gulf states' recognition of Israel. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan proudly announced they had approved a semi-final version of the pending agreement. Saudi Arabia was reportedly set to join the Abraham Accords on the eve of the October 7th Hamas massacre in Israel. Analysts believe that Iran, which directed and funded the attacks, did so in part to derail the peace process. The Biden administration has warned that the deal hinges upon the creation of a Palestinian state within the borders of Israel. However, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is staunchly opposed to this demand, saying Israel cannot accept a Palestinian terror state.
U.S. President Joe Biden supports an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, where Israel is fighting for its very existence against the genocidal Hamas terror group. The president attended a commencement ceremony at Morehouse College in Georgia and applauded as the class valedictorian delivered an anti-Israel tirade. When the president ascended the podium, he pledged to work to establish a Palestinian state. The Iranian-backed Hamas terror group still controls part of the Gaza Strip and continues to launch daily attacks on the Jewish state. In the aftermath of the October 7th massacre, Joe Biden pledged to support Israel as it fights to eradicate the terror group, but he has since changed his tune and turned on the Jewish state. In addition to withholding weapons shipments purchased by Israel, the president demanded that Israel halt its advance on Hamas and declare an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, is demanding that arrest warrants be issued for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Khan falsely accused the Israeli leaders of war crimes and of preventing aid from reaching the Gaza Strip. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu responded to the blood libel, saying that the false warrant is directed against the entire state of Israel. It's directed against the IDF soldiers who are fighting with supreme heroism against vile Hamas murderers.
In a first since the October 7th attacks on Israel, the United Nations Security Council has hosted a session dedicated to the hostages held in Gaza by Hamas. The UN meeting focused on condemning the hostage-taking in Israel on October 7th as a psychological tool of terrorism. While the Council has passed 3 resolutions calling for the immediate release of the Hamas hostages, it has also been critical of Israel's role to free them. Gilad Erdan, Israel's ambassador to the UN, lamented the world body's inaction, saying that the release of the remaining 128 hostages held by Hamas in Gaza is the most urgent and critical humanitarian issue before the Council. He noted that the United Nations still has not condemned Hamas, issued arrest warrants for Hamas leaders for their war crimes, or demanded that the Red Cross be allowed to check in on the hostages. He emphasized that since October 7th, the Security Council and the UN have done practically nothing to secure the release of the hostages.
Jerusalem has accused Cairo of trapping the citizens of Gaza and preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid by closing the Rafah border crossing. Egypt has constructed an elaborate fence to prevent Gazans fleeing the Hamas-controlled enclave from entering the Sinai. It has also called up Armored Corps units to ensure that Palestinians do not enter Egypt. On May 7th, Israeli troops seized the Rafah border crossing from Hamas. Egypt immediately shut down its side of the border and refused to coordinate the passage of aid trucks into the Gaza Strip.
Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich announced that he is supporting the abolishment of Israel's free trade agreement with Turkey. The already strained ties between the two nations reached a breaking point when Turkish leader Tayyip Erdogan openly supported Hamas after the October 7th massacre. He then called for a full halt of exports to Israel. Smotrich announced a 100% tax on Turkish imports, saying that the tariffs would remain in place as long as the dictator Erdogan remains in power.
The Netherlands is planning to move its embassy to the undivided Israeli capital, Jerusalem. Geert Wilders and his Party for Freedom received the highest vote in the Dutch national elections. Wilders is known for his conservative pro-Israel views. He recently visited the Jewish state, prayed at the Western Wall, and vowed to relocate his country's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This issue was approved during recent coalition negotiations, where 4 political parties in the Dutch lower house agreed to find the appropriate time to move the embassy to Jerusalem. When it does, Holland will join Papua New Guinea, Kosovo, Honduras, Guatemala, and the United States in Israel's undivided capital, Jerusalem.
The chair of the House Republican Conference, Elise Stefanik, addressed the Israeli Knesset recently, where she pledged to support the Jewish state. The GOP congresswoman lamented President Joe Biden's decision to block aid to Israel. She also voiced her opposition to the president's order to ease sanctions on Iran, which she described as paying a $6 billion ransom to the world's largest state sponsor of terror. The New York Republican vowed to honor George Washington's vision of religious pluralism and freedom. She said that means crushing anti-Semitism in America and supplying the state of Israel with what it needs, when it needs it, without conditions to achieve total victory in the face of evil.
The president of Sonoma University in California has given in to anti-Semitic pressure. Mike Lee penned an agreement with the pro-Hamas Students for Justice in Palestine. Part of that deal includes the academic boycott of Israeli universities. Lee also agreed to establish an advisory council for SJIP radicals. This violent anti-Israel group publicly praised the October 7th Hamas genocide in Israel, in which Iranian-backed terrorists infiltrated the Jewish state, slaughtered 1,200 people, and took 253 others hostage. After a major public protest over the agreement, Lee announced he was taking a leave of absence. The university has since been reminded that Lee's decision is in violation of state-enforced anti-BDS regulations and discrimination laws.
Iran has confirmed that representatives of the hardline Islamic Republic held indirect talks with American officials for the first time since January. The delegates reportedly discussed Tehran's rogue nuclear weapons program, as well as the murderous attacks on U.S. and Israeli interests by its proxy armies.
Products from Palestinian aid packages are being sold for exorbitant prices in the markets of Gaza. According to the New York Times, many items sent to the citizens of Gaza have been pillaged and are being sold at inflated prices. The article quoted Gazan civilians who said armed militants, most likely affiliated with Hamas, take possession of the free humanitarian supplies before they are distributed to the people in Gaza, and that Hamas is profiting by looting and selling the merchandise.
Hundreds of Jews and Christians gathered in Toronto, Canada, to escort 2 Jewish children to school after they were the targets of anti-Semitic attacks. The mother of one of the children reported the abuse to Toronto police after the youngster was pushed down at school and told that the bullies would do to him what Hamas did to Israel. Another child was pelted with rocks on his way home from school. When the police did not respond, the mother turned to the community for support. The next morning, hundreds of Canadians walked the children to school to show that they would not tolerate anti-Semitism.
The United States House of Representatives has passed a bill that would force President Joe Biden to deliver much-needed weapons to the Jewish state. In an unprecedented move, Biden has withheld arms transfers to Israel in an attempt to strong-arm Jerusalem into capitulating to Hamas in Gaza. Now, U.S. lawmakers are fighting back against the Biden administration and have threatened to stop funding to other government agencies if the White House does not comply with the terms of the sale. The measure would cut off financial support for the Pentagon, the U.S. State Department, and the National Security Council if Biden does not release the shipment or if he withholds any future transfers of weapons to Israel. President Biden is expected to veto the bill if it arrives on his desk in the Oval Office.
A pro-Israel Christian group has become the target of pro-Palestinian protesters in the United States. The Israel Summit, organized by the Hayovel organization, was slated to be held in Nashville, Tennessee last week, but a series of threats led the venue to cancel the summit and over 400 reservations. Pro-Palestinian activists got wind of the planned event and put out an urgent call to disrupt it. The Nashville-based Palestine Hura group instructed its followers to flood the hotel with calls, warning that they would not allow the conference to be held in their city. After being inundated with threats, the Sonesta Nashville Airport Hotel canceled the pro-Israel conference. Conservative broadcaster and finance expert Dave Ramsey stepped in and offered to host a bigger and better event. Organizers with Hayovel report there was an overwhelming response that resulted in even more people participating in the conference.
That concludes the news portion of our show. Stay tuned for Ask the Source with Josh Reinstein.
Hello and welcome to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein, and we're here in our beautiful studio in Jerusalem. My guest today is Cheryl Chumley. She is the opinion editor for the Washington Times. Cheryl, thank you for being on the show.
It's great to be with you, Josh. Thank you.
So it's amazing. You've come here, and you've been here now for 2 weeks, and you're here just getting to hear the stories from the people and understanding what's going on the ground. Why don't more journalists do that during wartime?
You know, I don't know. There are probably budget constraints on some of the news organizations, but really you can't get the full story unless you come to the scene. And you really can't get the full story in Israel unless you come to the scene for a significant amount of time, more than just 1 or 2 days.
You know what's interesting is that I read the Washington Times, and it's very fair and balanced, but almost all mainstream media is very slanted against Israel, and people don't understand why. You know, we're the only free democracy in the Middle East. Why is there always a negative slant against a true democracy?
That's a big question, right? And it would take more than just a minute or a bullet point to explain it. But I think that there are a lot of people in the media who just follow the government narrative without doing the due diligence of putting things in context, in historical truth, and so forth. And if you look at the United Nations, you look at many of the governments of the world, it really is against Israel.
You know, we see that there's some sort of moral comparison between the terrorist organization Hamas, which is recognized as a terrorist organization by the EU, by the United States of America, and Israel. And yet the media seems to be taking the Hamas line on these issues. How is that even possible?
It's really offensive to me, not just as a journalist, but as a person. I mean, for crying out loud, Hamas terrorists attacked Israel. And for a blink of an eye, the world was with Israel. And then a few hours later, it seemed like the media and the narrative were starting to turn the poor Palestinian people, the poor Palestinian civilians, and so forth. And really, if you look at what goes on in Gaza, there are very few so-called innocents there, at least in terms of what I've seen as a journalist. And so the reason that the world is turning against Israel, you know, it's biblical, it's anti-Semitism, and it's just outright bias. And it's a little bit offensive to me.
Well, you live in Washington, D.C. It's the Rome of our time. Yes. All eyes are on Washington, and yet we see that the Biden administration has also turned against Israel, not just the media, but they're starting to take some of the talking points from Hamas. They're starting to put pressure on Israel and take it off of Hamas. Why is this in American interest?
Well, Democrats traditionally have not been as strong on national security interests and strong on standing with their allies as other administrations. And when I look at what this Joe Biden administration is doing, I see it as a mirror of what the Barack Obama administration did toward Israel. And it's a shame that this administration, this White House, does seem to be throwing Israel under a bus. The only thing I can say is that there is a very large difference between the politics in America with throwing Israel on the bus and most of the American citizens who poll after poll after poll shows stand strongly with Israel.
Well, that's a very good question, too. A lot of people are speculating that the reason the Biden administration has turned on Israel is because they want to get more votes from the progressive. In recent polls, we've seen that 82% of Americans actually stand with Israel. Isn't him turning on Israel going to hurt him in the elections?
I hope so, to be honest, because I don't want him to win another 4 years in the White House. I think that would be devastating, not just for America, but for Israel and for all those with peace in their hearts around the world. So when you look at what you just said, it would seem by the numbers that Joe Biden couldn't possibly win by throwing Israel under the bus. But it seems to me politics is pushing him to continue that anti-Israel narrative because there's no other rational reason for it aside from hoping to win the election.
You're here and you're interviewing soldiers and members of parliament. What's the major thing or theme that you've seen that you wouldn't have gotten if you didn't come here and be on the ground?
Honestly, the strength of the Jewish people to endure and go through such a hardship as October 7th and then just carry on with their business, carry on with what you do, with what soldiers do, with families and so forth. I see them out on the street, just walking around with their families. And honestly, you wouldn't know by looking at them that they just suffered the worst attack in their history. It's just the endurance of the people is amazing to me.
Everyone's looking to the north. We believe that that's the next front, that Hamas was just the beginning. What do you see happening in the future when it comes to the north and Hezbollah?
I think that has a lot to do with how elections go in America, because I see under the previous administration, the Donald Trump administration, when he was strong pro-Israel, when he was strong on foreign policy, and really nobody around the world knew where he stood. They didn't know, if they said or stood out of line, said the wrong thing, what he would do as commander-in-chief. That actually worked for him because it kept the world more peaceful. And now you have a weak president in the White House, and it emboldens the enemies, not just of America, but of Israel around the world. So when you ask what do I expect from the North, I look at Hezbollah as taking advantage of Joe Biden's last few months in office and ratcheting attacks.
Well, the big question is Iran. They're funding Hezbollah, they're funding Hamas, the Houthis. Is anyone going to take them to task?
I don't think America under this president is going to do anything to incite Iran. I don't see them doing anything that puts a stop on Iran's spread of terror.
Cheryl, there are literally tens of millions of people watching this show. What message do you have for our viewing audience?
Stand strong in these dark times because it's faith that pulls you through, it's belief in God, and it's love for your fellow human being that will carry you through these dark times right now.
Thank you, Cheryl, for being on the show. And thank you for tuning in to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein. Now back to the studio.
And now the truth from Zion.
Qatar presents itself as a moderate force in the Middle East, but their actions speak louder than their words. Qatar is one of the biggest supporters of Islamic fundamentalism in the world, bankrolling and providing safe haven to terror organizations like Hamas.
Hamas's leadership are staying in five-star hotels in Qatar and are allowed to operate with impunity.
These criminals are not hiding. They're being treated like royalty, all the while plotting the next large-scale terrorist attack. The most confusing part is that Qatar is supposed to be an ally of the United States. Washington has close diplomatic ties with Doha. Qatar houses the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East, home to 10,000 American troops. Qatar may try to paint itself as a neutral mediator, but in reality, they are fueling the flames of conflict. October 7th was the largest single genocide of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. 1,200 men, women, and children were brutally mutilated, raped, and killed. 253 others were taken captive. While some women and elderly people were released in November, the majority of the hostages remain captives in primitive conditions in Gaza. Most are Israeli, but some are American, and a few are citizens of other countries. The United States, Egypt, Israel, and Qatar are working to negotiate terms with Hamas terrorists in hopes of a second and final hostage release. Qatar has made no progress in negotiating a deal to free them, despite having direct lines of communication and even control over Hamas. If Qatar was a true ally of the United States, the country would have already secured the release of the rest of the hostages, especially the American ones.
We need to pressure Qatar in order to force Hamas to release the hostages being held in Gaza. If Qatar wanted to, they could get this done in a matter of hours.
It's been more than half a year, and yet innocent people are still suffering underground in terror tunnels in Gaza. Qatari banks send billions of dollars to the Hamas-controlled enclave. Officials literally hand suitcases full of cash to terrorists in Gaza on a monthly basis. A recent investigation by experienced intelligence professionals from Israel and the CIA in the United States found Qatar to be a non-neutral negotiator. The probe was commissioned by legal representatives of the families affected by the events of the October 7th massacre. The findings highlight long-standing knowledge within U.S. intelligence circles regarding Qatar's nefarious activities that have never been adequately addressed. The lack of repercussions for Qatar's behavior led to consequences that even exacerbated previous conflicts, like the Arab Spring, the resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the empowerment of Hamas. The report confirmed that Qatar's support for terrorists culminated in the genocidal war against Israel. Another dangerous element in this deadly conflict is Qatar's influential worldwide Al Jazeera network. The news media company spews misinformation about Israel and gives a major platform to terrorists. Although Al Jazeera promotes itself as an independent, unbiased news network, the entire operation is funded by Qatar's oil-rich government. Al Jazeera allows the worst of humanity to share their lies and spread the ideology of radical Islam. An Egyptian cleric, Yusuf al-Qaradari, served as the spiritual leader of Hamas. He publicly encouraged suicide bombings and worked to legitimize killing Israeli women and children. Despite his well-known proclivity for violence, Qaradari was given a weekly TV program on Al Jazeera. It allowed him to share his hate-filled messages with the gullible masses. An unlimited budget allows the network to turn out quality content with a high capacity for lies and misinformation. Al Jazeera journalists on the ground in Israel and Gaza have been involved in supporting the agenda of Hamas, sharing sensitive information they have learned in Israel in order to assist Hamas in its genocidal war. Al Jazeera denies allegations that it spreads hate and supports terrorism, but research proves the opposite. Qatar also uses its enormous wealth from oil and natural gas exports to financially contribute to academic institutions in America, propping up professors and administrations who subscribe to anti-Israel sentiment and blatant anti-Semitism. The international community needs to hold Qatar accountable for its sinister and public support of terrorism. Qatar cannot be allowed to hide behind a facade of diplomacy while aiding and abetting organizations that thrive on terror, violence, and extremism. Up next, the ICEJ report from the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem.
Shalom, dear friends, here from Jerusalem. I want to approach you today with a complicated subject, and that is, what does the Bible say about war? And also, is Israel committing war crimes today in the Middle East? Of course, many Christians, in particular in the Western world, they are leaning very strong to pacifism. They say Christians should at no point enter into a war situation. And this situation, or this attitude in particular, arose in the dawn of World War II, that saw such horrendous bloodshed all across Europe and even beyond Europe. And Christians came to the conclusion that Christians should have no place in any war whatsoever. However, this is an attitude, of course, that the Western world can afford today, because neither most part of Europe, neither the United States or the North American continent were engaged on their own continent in any warlike situation. And I want to quote here one of our friends and theologian, Cheryl, who wrote in one of the recent essays he did about the war and conflict with Hamas in Gaza. He says the following: pacifism is the immoral privilege reserved for those who sit safely at home. And I believe there is a lot of truth to that, because here in Israel we cannot afford being pacifist, because otherwise the state of Israel would not be surviving. Israel needs to have his young men in the army to defend the safety of the nation of Israel, and they could not survive otherwise. And I want to quote a few centuries earlier, one of the church saints, Thomas Aquinas, what his take on war was. And he actually coined an expression that was called a just war. He says in his mind there is something like a just war. He says Christians should avoid, in any case, if possible, any war. But he says there is a just war under three conditions. He says, number one, he says, a just war is a just war when it's not initiated by individuals or by small militias. It needs to come from the king or from the government. And secondly, he says a just war is a war that has a just cause. That means it needs to punish evil and rectify wrong that are carried out. And thirdly, he says a war is a just war when the end of that war will be a more peaceful, a more righteous, a more just situation for the parties of that war. And in a way, I believe this definition can be helpful even applying to this current conflict, because I can assure you that Israel is not engaging this war with any vicious intents, but actually they want to bring forth a more peaceful solution and situation for the communities, not only around Gaza, but also for everybody who is living in Gaza. And I believe there is no doubt today around the world that the regime of Hamas in Gaza, it is an evil regime that defies any respect for human rights or human dignity or human values. And there is a great consensus around the world that they need to disappear from the Gaza communities, and if possible also from other areas in the Middle East. And I want you to pray for Israel in your churches, in your congregation, that they experience that the Lord is mighty in battle on their side, that he is fighting their battles as they are ridding the world of the evil of this wicked terrorist organization. And I wish you God's blessing to that. Shalom from Jerusalem.
That's all for this edition of Israel Now News. I'm Rebecca Roberts.
And I'm Yochanan Elrom, reporting from our studio in Jerusalem. Join us again next week for all of your Israel updates.